Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
Crime Redefined is excited to announce that this episode is being sponsored by MBA DNA Consulting, LLC in Los Angeles, California. Founder Mehul Anjaria strives to bridge science and law by providing forensic DNA consultation to attorneys and inmates. Check out mbadnaconsulting.com for more information and follow on Twitter at MBA Consult. On this episode of Crime Redefined, we are taking a disturbing look at forensic fraud, or the misuse of forensic science in serious criminal cases.
The cases we've chosen to look at are definitely very troublesome and a little bit depressing, but I think that they're useful to dissect the issues that lead to the misapplication of forensic science. Some of these instances we're going to talk about are just outright nefarious. Others, I think, point just to lack of not applying fundamentals and maybe even perhaps not realizing the magnitude of one's work as a forensic scientist in such serious matters. In fact, if I were training a new analyst right now, I think I would make reading these cases mandatory training.
Well, let's dig in and get right to our first case, or in this case, cases, the Massachusetts drug lab scandals.
Yeah, so this one takes a little bit of introduction, but we'll start with the case of Annie Dukin. She was a drug lab analyst. She started in 2004 in the Massachusetts Department of Health Laboratory in Boston. And she was a real go-getter, so it would seem. She was on fire. They called her the superwoman of the lab. And that's because of her output. So in her first year there, she was cranking out 700 drug analysis cases in a month. And that was twice as much as the person in second place was. In fact, in 2009, there was a court ruling called Melendez-Diaz, which basically said drug analysts need to show up in court more often because the defendant has a right to cross-examine them. So what that meant is that analysts were spending more time in court, less in the lab. Even though that was the case, she was still doing 3 times as many cases as other people in the laboratory. So was she that good, or what was going on? And so at one point, a coworker became suspicious. He or she realized that, well, she's not in the lab all that often anymore. And he actually started counting her microscope slides as an indication as to how much work she was putting out. And that analyst found out that it just didn't add up, that she couldn't substantiate the work that she was doing. Now, this all came to a head in about 2011. So that's 7 years after she started. So apparently Annie Dukin took 90 samples out of an evidence locker, and she forged her coworker's initials when she went to check them back in. And so she was taken off of casework, basically given kind of admin duty, and this started a big criminal investigation. And initially, of course, they wanted to it looked like, well, she might have done a few bad things, but it wasn't that big of a deal. But as it turned out, what she was doing is she was dry labbing, which means that she was not even analyzing all of these drugs. She was just cranking out a report saying it's meth, it's coke, just by looking at it visually. And in fact, if tests would come back negative, she would go ahead and spike those samples with real drugs. So she was just pretty much making this crap up. On top of that, she was testifying that she had a master's degree when she didn't have one. So the way this shook out is that she ended up pleading guilty to 27 counts of misleading investigators, tampering with evidence, and filing false reports. She ended up doing almost 3 years in prison. But the fallout of this was crazy. Ultimately, after a 5-year investigation that cost millions of dollars, they dismissed, I think it was, Dion, like 24,000 cases that she had been involved in. And these cases had a big impact on people's lives. There were people who were deported out of the U.S. as a result of their drug conviction. So you figure, well, how could this happen? Well, there weren't any cameras in the laboratory, and there was very poor security overall. So she was able to just kind of run wild and do what she did. So once that was kind of coming to an end in 2013, yet another scandal took place. So now we're talking about Sonia Farek. And so in January of 2013, we had another scandal at a drug lab in Amherst, Massachusetts. So an analyst tracked 2 samples that had been missing from evidence to Sonia Farek's laboratory bench. And they found that those packages of the missing evidence were sliced open and the contents were apparently altered. And once again, the officials tried to get out in front of this, and they said, well, we don't think there was any due process violations for any of the defendants, and, the drugs were tested properly. But they had not gotten all the evidence yet. So when she was arrested, they found at her desk a crack pipe, and I don't mean evidence. This was a loose crack pipe in her desk. They found materials to make fake cocaine, like baking soda and soap, and there were other drugs as well, cocaine, right in her work desk. And the way that they arrested her is that she was actually testifying in court. And on a lunch break, she went out to her car to smoke crack. And mind you, she was going to testify in the afternoon. So as she was leaving her car to then go back to court, the detectives arrested her. And ultimately, when they searched her car, they found drug paraphernalia, and they found worksheets from drug therapy that she was attending. So they found out through her testimony and through some of these worksheets from her therapy that, she had started in the lab in 2004, and she started immediately abusing drugs. So initially, the people investigating her thought, well, okay, this broke in 2012, 2013. We'll just go back and look at the last few months because you probably got hooked on drugs. But it turned out she was literally high on drugs working these cases since probably about 2004. Now, she ended up doing 18 months in jail, and I think something like 12,000 cases had to be dismissed as a result of this. So that was the fraud on the analyst. But what was even more disturbing in Sonia Farek was the cover-up that the prosecutors then engaged in. So obviously every defense attorney in that area wanted all the discovery possible about this analyst to see if they could get their case dismissed. And by finding these diaries in her car of when she was going to drug therapy and listing literally the dates that she was doing drugs, you could tell whether or not she was high when she worked a particular case. And apparently the prosecutors were trying to fight this tooth and nail and cover it up. So one scandal kind of led to another. So, Dion, that's a mouthful. I know you're chomping at the bit to give me some commentary. What do you got?
Well, my head just exploded, and I don't even know where to start.
Right.
First of all, my question is what the hell is going on in Massachusetts?
No doubt.
L.A., Chicago, New York, maybe Miami, I get. But Massachusetts, first thing is obviously, where's the oversight? I mean, you mentioned 7,000 per month. I would guess, I'm no DNA expert, you are, but that would be a red flag right off the bat. I mean, I can get what they call her superwoman, but 7,000 a month when no one else is touching that, I mean, it's just something that's physically just doesn't seem possible, right?
Yeah, so you have to wonder why they didn't look into that. But, I guess the supervisors thought, oh, wow, she's a great employee. Look at her knocking it out of the park. So somehow that must blind you to what could be going on.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I'll hit Annie first.
Yeah.
I'm going to bust a little cool hand Luke on you and go old school.
Okay.
What we have here is a vigilante chemist and a liar. 21,000 drug cases were dismissed. I mean, literally, you cannot make that up. And I think about all of the people that were affected by this.
Yeah, no doubt. And then her reasoning was kind of weird on this. She was not addicted to drugs, as far as we could tell. She just wanted to be an overachiever. And apparently she had, a grudge against people who were, drug addicts as well. And she thought this was a good way, I guess, to exact her own justice.
She should have started on the other lab. She should have started on, we should have went after the other lab tech, Sonia. I mean, her, I get. She was just an addict who happened to be a chemist.
Right.
I mean, it was a assembly line, test, use, test, use, rinse, repeat. I mean, she was literally, as they were coming through, taking a hit, moving it through, and going on. It's a little bit, I kind of understand that because she's just was more of an addict. But what I don't get is the Massachusetts AG.
Yeah.
And basically their little take was nothing to see here, move on. This isn't going to affect too many cases. I don't understand why the knee jerk for this is to protect and, just take your medicine and just get it straightened out and go forward. But to sit there and go, hey, there's nothing to see here. It's only going to be a handful of cases. That's almost criminal in itself.
I think it was almost disbelief because right after Dukin was sort of coming to an end, this exploded. And I think that they were just like, we can't have this again. We can't believe we're going through it. That's no excuse whatsoever. But it's almost like they were overwhelmed with this. But then what they forget about is you now make it worse because now there's wrongdoing. But by blocking the defense from figuring out how bad it is, you're just making this way, way worse. I mean, once you've been exposed that much, why not just let it all hang out?
Yeah, that was going to be my comment. You rip the Band-Aid off. On the first round, they probably thought they were at the bottom of the barrel, and the second one hits. Just come clean, full transparency. Bring maybe an outside team in, do a full scrub, and just take your medicine. Otherwise, the cover-up can create even more of a false sense of justice. I mean, everybody is going to be questioning the election, so to speak. Wow, was I part of this? So it's better just to come clean and just take your medicine and move on.
Yeah. So, with Farrick, kind of the way this started was, I guess, in a drug lab, you have to have standards of each drug, which means I go buy it from a company. I know it's methamphetamine. So I can use that to test all my instruments and all of that kind of stuff. I have a ground truth that this substance is meth. So apparently Farrick, she started kind of nipping from the meth standard every day. And over the course of 4 years, she emptied that out. 4 years. Now, I worked in drug labs. That's where I started. And I should note that this is relatively simple chemical analysis. So, yeah, you do multiple cases in a day. 700 a month, I don't know. That's a bit much. But it's not like a DNA case. You are doing multiple in a day. It's not all that difficult. Like I say, that's where you start out because the stakes are a little bit lower, unless you botch 21,000 cases, of course. But then Farrick, so back to the standards, as I recall working lab, every time we used a standard, we had to log exactly how much we used. Why? Because it's a controlled substance and you have to account for it.
Right.
So over 4 years, she guzzled this liquid meth and, there was no accounting for it at all. So had that standard been tracked, that would have been one way they could have caught her. And then and I don't know if I mentioned this, but so from there, she actually started taking drugs out of the evidence as well. And sometimes replacing it. So
yeah, that's kind of why I said I understand, the Annie's got probably more of maybe a little bit of mental illness in there, but Farrick was just she was just an addict. And then obviously you got to feed the addiction. And so you start, breaking into the evidence locker to take stuff out and kind of go from there. But how long do you think that's going to have an impact on the justice system in Massachusetts? Decades, right?
Yeah, I have a feeling. I don't know for a fact, but these labs must not have been accredited, obviously, based on some of these standards. So I believe the Massachusetts State Police got involved and took over at least one of these laboratories. But defense attorneys probably have material for years. They can always refer back to this and demand proof that how do I know it's not better, or how do I know this won't happen again?
Yeah, that's a tough one, especially if you're on the other end of that, where it was you're on the defense and you're doing everything you can to put a case forward, and you got the lab techs working against you as well.
Yeah, no doubt. All right,
you want to move on to Sean?
Yeah, I think we better to beat that one to death.
Let's go to Sean Parcells and his questionable autopsy practices. And again, for our listeners, this is another one that you just can't make it up.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what to call Sean Parcells, but let's go back to 2014. We had the Michael Brown. He was shot by the police. This was the Ferguson, Missouri touched off a lot of discussion, shall we say. And you might have seen in the media, there was discussion of Michael Baden doing the autopsy, famed Michael Baden,
right,
doing the autopsy of Michael Brown. And apparently this character, Sean Parcells, would appear with him on camera and I guess talk about the findings. And he was positioning himself as a media expert in pathology. And there had been some buzz about questioning his qualifications even back then. So once he started getting more scrutiny on him, some of the things that came up were that, he had a bachelor's degree. At one point, he was accepted into medical school, but he never went. Medical school in the Caribbean. He definitely was not a doctor. He was very vague about whether or not he had a master's degree from a chiropractic college. When he was interviewed, he kind of didn't give a straight answer on that. He would hold himself out as a professor. And in fact, after people started poking into his business, I guess after 2014, he started using his middle name. So he was known as Professor Lynn versus Professor Parcells. But when they started talking to schools that he said he was a professor at, they said, no way. One of them was Washburn University. They said, well, he came in one time and he gave a talk to some nursing students, but that's about it. He's certainly not an adjunct professor. Now, in a few weeks, I'm going to go give a class in DNA at a law school, but you can be damn sure I'm not going to say that I'm an adjunct law professor as a result of doing that. Now there's a whole question of if you're not a doctor, should you even be doing autopsies, right? And you would think the answer is no. I guess it depends on the state. Some do, some don't. Some people have said, though, that he holds himself out as a doctor as well. Back in 2011, there was a case where he was hired to, I guess, take the brain of a man and send it to Harvard Medical School. And the family, I guess, never got a report from Harvard. So they took on legal action. And ultimately, there was a deposition in 2011. So Mr. Parcells shows up to the deposition with a bucket. And guess what's in the bucket? The brain. So, I mean, this is just very, very odd behavior. Now, this really came to a head earlier this year. So basically, in Kansas, Parcells was criminally charged for theft by deception and desecration of bodies. So dozens of people were saying that they paid him $2,000 to $3,000 for a private autopsy and never got any types of results. On top of that, there were allegations that police could not prosecute on some cases due to the quality of his autopsy work. And he was making other claims. Like, I guess there was a funeral home in Naperville, Illinois, that he did some autopsies at. And then he claimed he had an office there. And the people at that funeral home were like, no, that's not the case. During his court proceedings in 2019, I think you saw this too, he took the news to his laboratory. And they described it as a back alley office. And you could see in there was all sorts of body parts piled up and all this kind of stuff. There was an official position statement by the American Association of Pathologist Assistants. I mean, so if he's not a doctor, he must be assistant, right? They said he doesn't even meet the qualifications for that. So a lot of egregious stuff. I mean, errors in his reports, signatures from doctors who say, hey, I never signed that report. In one case, it was really kind of sad. In the report, he talked about the man's prostate, and the family said he didn't have a prostate. It had been removed. So this is really, really eerie. And I don't know. What do you make of this, Dion?
I'm sorry, but there's something way, way deeper going on with this guy. I mean, who does he think he is? H.H. Holmes? I just got finished reading Bloodstains, and this is like deja vu.
It is.
I mean, some of these scams he was running were really similar to H.H. Holmes in Chicago. I mean, it's crazy. It just sounds like he wanted to be paid for cutting people up. I mean, there's even a little Jeffrey Dahmer in there.
Yeah, there's a couple of issues here. I mean, okay,
a couple.
A couple. By the way, I got to add this. So I also read that he's got other businesses besides the autopsy business. And apparently...
Shocking.
Yeah. So I guess several years ago, he'd advertised that he was a Christian minister and he was offering premarital counseling and weddings and funerals. And then he's got some sort of investment, Parcells Capital Investments as well. So he's really a Renaissance man. But,
no, I'm telling you, this is Holmes reincarnated.
Yeah, right.
I mean, this is really some of the same scans. I wonder if somehow he did some investigation and read a book and said, hey, you know what, I can do this.
Well, but the difference is H.H. Holmes actually went to medical school.
Yeah,
and
that's
was
true.
Brilliant.
Michigan, right?
I think it was Michigan, yeah. So, all right, couple issues here. Number one, was he perpetrating a fraud? In other words, was he collecting money and not doing the work? Kind of seems to be the case when there's that many complaints. I know when they talk to him on the news, by the way, he's very chatty, He talks to reporters and he's very calm, and he just kind of played it off as, well, you know what?
Well, most sociopaths are, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's kind of like, well, we just didn't get to it and we need to write a report. And some of the reasons that people didn't get reports is because, well, there's now a restraining order against me to do work in Kansas. So that was his excuse. And you could watch online one of the articles, you can watch him testify on the stand, and they take him through all of this. And at the very end, he tells the judge, well, I guess I'll just have to move to another state. If you won't let me do my work in Kansas, I'll just have to move to Missouri.
Yeah,
very nonchalant about it.
All right, before we move on, where is this guy today?
Well, I think he was in court earlier this year, and they were going to, he's got criminal charges, for theft and desecration. So that's going through the system still, I'm sure. So I guess the other issue here is there's the fraud, but then it's like, does he actually have the qualifications? Well, we know he doesn't have the qualifications, but is his work actually sound? That's the other part of this.
Right.
He says he has on-the-job experience with this, but not formal training. So then you wonder, all the autopsies he did, are they legit? Well, we have that one where the family's saying, well, my dad didn't have a prostate. So, well, if
that becomes the bar, we're in trouble. Across the board in society, if that's the bar.
Yeah, so Dion, this one's still shaking out. But last we heard, he was going to set up shop in another state and just, I guess, keep making money while he can.
So listeners, beware. Keep an eye out for this guy, and just run away if you come across him. All right, let's hit an oldie but a goodie. The case of the Oklahoma City Police Department, Joyce Gilchrist.
Yeah, all right. So
what's the scoop on her?
Oh boy. Okay, this will take a while as well. I'll try to distill it down the best I can. She was a criminalist with the Oklahoma City Police Department. She started in 1980, and she was a criminalist for 21 years. During that time, she was involved in about 3,000 cases. She was given the nickname Black Magic because she was so good at helping prosecutors get convictions. In one trial, the defense attorney said, she seemed to be able to do things with evidence that nobody else was able to. So thus, Black Magic. And some of the other rap on her is that she would treat discovery requests from the defense with contempt, and she would keep evidence from the defense. So let me go into a couple of case examples. And there's a great paper by Paul Gianelli called Scientific Fraud. He's out of Case Western Reserve University. He did a very good job of summarizing these cases. So I'm going to kind of go through some of his summary here. So we have the case of Curtis McCarty. And originally, there was some hair evidence in this rape murder. And Mr. McCarty was excluded based on microscopic exam of hair. At some point, another suspect identified McCarty as the perpetrator, and Joyce Gilchrist reviewed some more hairs, and all of a sudden she found a match between McCarty and the crime scene. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. So, 2 months before trial, the defense said, you know what, I'd like to see discovery, meaning I want to see all your notes, protocols, all that kind of stuff, and we want the samples so we can do independent testing. All right, this is 2 months before the trial. On the very first day of trial, the defense got the samples to test. So there was obviously some deliberate stonewalling. And what was really odd about this is that when Gilchrist testified about the work that the defense expert did, she actually put the blame on him and said, how could you have done a good analysis if you just got the samples the first day of trial? So basically, the defense expert testified that, Gilchrist didn't find any pubic hairs on the victim that matched McCarty. But then all of a sudden, Gilchrist in trial says, yeah, there was one that was consistent, and that even though that wasn't in her report. And she went on to say, I guess that because his hair was on her, that he must have been at that scene, which obviously nobody can say, just because you find a hair there, it could have got there any number of ways. So in this case, McCarty was retried and convicted, but then he was ultimately released from death row because when they went to do DNA testing, they found all the evidence had been destroyed. So
yeah, this is just like another one that's absolutely just maddening. I mean, I always put myself in the people, the underdog or the short end of the stick. I mean, you are already the underdog when you walk into court.
Yes.
The prosecution has all the resources in the world, and so now you're telling me, and we're probably scaring the hell out of our listeners right now when they go to listen to this, that you have to fight against the corrupt lab chemists. I mean, 23 people in this dealing with her were being sentenced to death. 12
yes.
who have been already executed.
Yeah, I mean, my gosh, the stakes couldn't be higher. So let me give you a couple more horrors, Miss Gilchrist. Case of Jeffrey Pierce, okay? A rape case. He voluntarily submitted head and pubic hairs, thinking that would clear him. And guess what Gilchrist came up with? She said that Pierce's hair matched hairs that were at the crime scene, and he got convicted. Now, this went to appeal. They actually upheld the ruling, but they noted that there were some shenanigans, that Gilchrist failed to turn over some evidence to the defense, and that her report was incomplete. Now, at some point, the FBI did an investigation of Gilchrist in 8 different cases, and they determined that in 6 of them, she misidentified hairs, and in 1, she misidentified fibers. And Pierce's case was one of those. In other words, there was no correlation between Pierce's hair and the crime scene hair. It was just nonsense. And ultimately, a private lab did DNA testing, and they were able to exonerate Pierce, who then went on to sue Gilchrist and other officials and got around $4 million.
Good for him.
Yeah. So one more case, Alfred Mitchell. Okay, so
no relation.
No relation to Dion, correct. Gilchrist testified that there was sperm present on anal and vaginal swabs from the victim. The problem is she already had an FBI report that said there was no sperm. And she also knew that sperm on the victim's panties actually matched her boyfriend, who was not a suspect. Now, what's even crazier is that FBI report was never turned over to the defense, so they had no idea. And once again, the prosecutor is implicated in this as well, because they were trying to obscure that FBI report that clearly flew in the face of what Gilchrist was testifying to.
Yeah, this is just win, baby, at any cost. You know what? Let's just get the prosecution's not going to question it because it gives them what they need to win the case, and they build their resume.
So that's it. So some of the other findings overall in Gilchrist's work was that there were a lot of cases where there was missing evidence. So, hey, we're the defense. We want to do post-conviction DNA testing. Tough crap. It's gone. Contamination issues due to evidence being stacked all over her desk. She had a systematic destruction of rape evidence after 2 years, which is obviously well before the statute of limitations. And other things like she wasn't doing proficiency testing and you name it, just a smorgasbord of nonsense. And
what do you think is behind her? Like some of the other ones, we get the addict. The other one had a superwoman complex, but she seems this one seems a little bit different. What do you think was behind Gilchrist's motivation?
I guess because she was a rock star in that she was getting convictions. She made the prosecutors happy. Apparently on the stand, she was very persuasive. And I guess this behavior was reinforced. I didn't see any other motive for this, really. It did say something I read, like she had little notes to jog her memory. And she would say, like, she would refer to, like, people in the case, like, if they were gay, she had derogatory terms for them. So some sort of axe to grind somewhere. But I don't know. I think unfortunately, some of these lab people feel like, yeah, I'm on the prosecution team and let's get these guys. And if there's a technicality, to hell with it. We'll fix the lab report to make it right. Let's just get the scum off the street.
Yeah, it just seems like they just want to be like you said, part of the team and all the perks that come along with that.
And a lot of these jurisdictions, especially years ago, they didn't really approve funding for defense review of these cases, because that's the other thing. Nowadays, if you have a opposing expert looking at it, you might be able to identify some of these things. But it seems with Gilchrist that even if there was defense, she would do shoddy work, but then she would stonewall any attempt for them to look at her reports or do additional testing.
Yeah, I mean, do you have a number on how many cases of hers were dismissed?
I don't have a number, but there's quite a few here.
All right, let's go on to the Houston Crime Lab. They've had a series of scandals over the years. Tell us a little bit how this all got started.
Yeah, so Houston PD is really notorious, and the first issue was in about 2002. By the way, Houston PD services Harris County, where there are more executions than any place in the entire United States. So this is really a problem. And so in 2002, the entire DNA lab was shut down. And one of the cases they found that was problematic was the case of Josiah Sutton. Ultimately, in 2004, he was exonerated after a 5-year sentence. So this was a rape case. Initially, the victim ID'd Sutton and one other person. So there were some semen in the back of a car. Houston PD analyzed it, and they said, okay, there's DNA from 2 people here. Sutton is included, along with 1 in 694,000 people. So, that sounds like pretty powerful evidence, right? Well, the true number shouldn't have been 1 in 694,000. It should have been 1 in 16. And furthermore, when experts looked at the testing, they disagreed with the conclusion altogether. And in fact, there weren't 2 people. There was a single contributor, and it wasn't Sutton. So they just out and out got it wrong. And so there were other cases in Houston as well. And basically the findings in the lab were that technicians were misinterpreting data. They were poorly trained. They kept shoddy records. They would use up all the evidence so it couldn't be retested. So again, it's kind of like covering your tracks if you're doing bad work.
Did I read this right that there was no charges?
Yeah, it's very rare. That's another good point. It's very rare that the actual analyst is charged. Very often they're dismissed. Maybe they're sued. You had a different situation, I guess, in the drug cases in a way, because you were tampering. Well, I don't know. I mean, there you're tampering with the controlled substances, but here you're tampering with DNA evidence potentially. So it's interesting.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me.
No.
Why they wouldn't charge anybody, if nothing else, just to, make an example out of somebody.
Yeah, exactly. Other issues in Houston, this one expert who I think really blew this open, Elizabeth Johnson, she was saying that, one case she looked at, a technician testified that a swab of the victim found semen, even though the lab report said there was no semen. So what is that? I mean, just testifying to something different than the report. It wasn't over in Houston. I mean, through the years, they've had other issues. In 2008, they had a little bit of a scandal where some analysts were cheating on a proficiency test. And then in 2014, an analyst was fired for lying, using improper procedures, and tampering with an official record. So, I guess
this stuff is all top down. So who's leading this department? That's the person that you got to go after, unless there's some kind of a monetary motivation for these people. Otherwise, you got no one's watching.
Yeah, it's very true, and I hope that nowadays we've got accreditation, we've got Innocence Project, we got more of these being revealed. That hopefully that would be a deterrent to future bad actors, but it's always hard to figure out what the motivation is.
Man. Do you want to move on to the big one?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's go to some more recent ones. And these, we've got some less info on because they're still being played out. But most people are familiar with Henry Lee.
Right.
Very high-profile forensic expert. He was on the OJ case. He famously said something's wrong with the blood evidence. He was on John Benet Ramsey. You name a high-profile case, basically, he was on it. And I first saw Henry Lee speak in 1996. This was right after OJ. And, I was very excited. I was a brand new criminalist. I was very excited to see his presentation, get some inside info on OJ. And he struck me as very, very charismatic and personable. He was telling, sort of dirty jokes that you wouldn't expect from like a nerdy scientist. And you could tell he would have a way with jurors. But some things have come up in recent years about his work that have really called his work into question. And so one case that was pointed out recently dates back to 1989. And Sean Henning and Ricky Birch were accused of slitting Everett Carr's throat and stabbing him many times, something like 27 times. And it was interesting that if they were accused of the stabbing, why there was no blood on them anywhere after such a violent stabbing. And ultimately, there was a towel that was found in a bathroom. And Dr. Lee testified that on that towel, there was a substance identified to be blood. And so the prosecutors took that and ran with it and said, aha, that's why these guys don't have blood on them. They wiped up with this towel. And the issue here was that there wasn't actually laboratory testing that showed that there was blood in that towel. What Dr. Lee said was that at the scene, he did like a quick and dirty presumptive test. But then once you do that, you have to do further testing to actually confirm that there's blood there. So the Innocence Project did test the towel years later, and they found no blood whatsoever. So Dr. Lee's response is that, hey, I just did this quick and dirty test. I didn't confirm that it was blood. But to me, the question is there any documentation that he did that test at all? That remains to be seen. So a little thing like that, is it blood? Is it not blood? That could turn the entire case. And there's another one that's very similar to that he was involved in. This is the David Weinberg case. Victim was Joyce Stockmull, 1984 murder. And so there was a knife that Weinberg, the defendant, had that Lee testified had blood on it, but he didn't know the source of it. So he just identified blood. But there had been other testing at that time that showed that it was either animal blood or not blood at all. And for whatever reason, Lee ignored that information and didn't present it to a jury. He also said that there were 3 hairs in the trunk of the defendant that were consistent with the victim. Ultimately, those were tested. It was found that 2 of the 3 could not, and one of them was inconclusive. So the first part sounds like just wrong, misleading testimony, right? You knew that there were other test results that said that this is not even confirmed to be human blood. The other one with the hair evidence, that becomes more interesting because we know that the science of using a microscope to identify hairs is flawed. So what we don't know is it a question of the science or is it a question of Dr. Lee? Now, Joyce Gilchrist, she was doing microscopic hair comparisons as well, but they specifically found that when they looked at her notes, she didn't have enough data to back up her findings. So she was just purely almost dry labbing it. Here with Lee, we don't know. One more on Lee. This is the Wendell Hassan case from 1986, where Lee at the time said there were blood on a pair of sneakers. 2014, they looked at the sneakers again. They found no blood. So his explanation was that maybe it was used up in the original testing or maybe it had degraded over the years. So these are all kind of new findings, but I got to say that, some of these convictions have been thrown out as a result of the questions over Dr. Lee's testing.
I'm going to leave all the forensics to you as you're the expert, but what I can't get past and the reoccurring theme that just keeps popping up as we go through these cases is this kind of the way that these forensic scientists see themselves as rock stars. And this quote I found from Henry Lee kind of gives you a little bit of window into that. He said, "You must have a winner's attitude. The loser always says there is no way. The winner always finds a way." So for me, that's lots of selling, but also I don't want always find a way from a forensic science.
Right.
I mean, science doesn't lie. Either it is or it isn't. There's no selling. There's no finding a way. You do the analysis. You present it, and anything beyond that is extremely scary for everybody that's on the opposite end. But for him, I really see that he saw himself as as more of a celebrity than he did as a forensic scientist. He always popped up on the big cases. He gave the sound bites. He gave the prosecution or whoever was, he was paying the ammunition they needed for their case. It's just really scary. I mean, what's behind this? Fame, fortune? I mean, he gives a really bad name to experts.
Well, what's worse than him thinking he's a rock star is the jurors and the judge thinking he's a rock star.
That's a good point.
So they're going to just give deference to whatever he says. Now, in a way, that's already true with law enforcement crime lab analysts. Joe Blow jurors be like, oh, this guy works for the sheriff's department, has a lot of credentials. Yeah, I'm going to believe what they say. And maybe I'm going to tend to, if the defense pays another guy to come in, maybe I'm going to look at them a little bit crooked. But now bring in a celebrity type guy, even if he makes a little mistake or a misstatement, that's just going to get blown over. Like, well, Dr. Lee knows what he's talking about.
Well, exactly. So, I mean, I remember when he was on the OJ case, and it was like gospel. I mean, It's like, I remember a week's worth of coverage. Oh, wow. The OJ's got Henry Lee coming in. I mean, this case is over,
But, okay, so just on a little technical note here, because there's kind of a theme here. Let's say I'm at a crime scene and I see something that looks like a blood stain. I want to make sure before I take that to the lab that it's not ketchup, taco sauce, something like that. So I can do in the field a quick and dirty presumptive test. Now, a presumptive test doesn't confirm it. It just means that, hey, you know what? This might be blood. Go ahead and collect it. It doesn't tell me for sure it's blood. And guess what? It doesn't tell me species either. So I don't know if that's dog blood, cat blood, human blood, or what. You can't stop there. If you just testify that based on that there's blood, you are misstating the evidence. That sample has to be further tested, confirmed for blood, DNA, other tests that would support the idea that it's human blood. So again, if you've got someone with a lot of credentials who says, hey, this is blood, who's going to question that?
Right.
Particularly if you don't have the defense expert and all the discovery at the time. So the Innocence Project is pretty awesome in going back and looking at all of these and unearthing these past mistakes.
Man, this is where is he? What's Henry Lee's status today?
He's 81 years old. I know that he teaches, but he's been defending himself pretty vehemently.
Do you see an impact of all this catching up to him?
Well, I think so. Now, because there are literally convictions being thrown out, based on concerns about him. I don't think he's going to hold the same cachet in trials anymore.
Wow. That's a tough way to end a career.
Yeah, no doubt. So we got one more here. This is really hot off the press.
Yeah.
Because you thought this was all old news, right? Back in the old days of forensics, we had all these mess ups.
No, this is this one right out of the gate from the analyst's resignation in Texas, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is the case. Victim is Haruka Weiser. She was a University of Texas student. Defendant is looks like Mikhail Kreiner. And in June of 2019, there was an admissibility hearing for some DNA samples. So there was some testing originally. There were some DNA mixtures that were hard to interpret. Well, there's a new way to interpret DNA mixtures using computers. In this case, they used a program called StarMix. And so the defense wanted to have an admissibility hearing before the trial to determine if this evidence should even come in. At that hearing, it was decided that it should not come in, not because of the foundation of StarMix, but the way the analyst did the procedures. Well, that was the end of that. Okay, that happens. Just this month, it also came out in that hearing that this analyst on 10 times testified incorrectly. So basically, she said that on a thigh swab from the victim, that Kreiner's DNA could be excluded from being present, when in fact, what the results showed is that it was inconclusive. Now, you could probably misspeak once, right? It happens. This is highly technical testimony. She did it 10 times during her testimony. So,
and what was her take on that?
Well, So apparently, for whatever reason, this boggles my mind, she didn't have her actual report in front of her. She had some of her lab notes. And on the lab notes, it said excluded. Now, I don't understand this for the life of me, why you wouldn't have your report. That's just, it really boggles the mind. And so there's a long report you can read online. It's the final report on self-disclosure by the Texas Department of Public Safety regarding the testimony of Jody Kaler. And so basically, here's their conclusion. I'll just read it. Ms. Kaler provided inaccurate testimony as to the results and conclusions of the DNA analysis in Kreiner. The erroneous testimony impacted the criminal case by substantially affecting the integrity of the results and conclusions presented. So what's her... We talked about, well, the lab notes, but basically, I think her response is, I misspoke.
10 times?
10 times. Yeah. So I'm going to go back to a comment I made initially. Fundamentals. Prepare for your testimony. Make sure you have all your records in front of you and know them and don't guess. Now, you can always in court, you try not to just read your report verbatim. You try to testify from memory, especially on general concepts. But if you need to look at some kind of detail, this is what you do. May I refer to my notes? And then the judge will say yes, if that will assist you in refreshing your memory.
You know, I hate to keep harping back to this, but once again, it was amazing how all of her colleagues, in this particular case, they stick up. You know, they were like, they're always the most professional person ever. You know, like I was reading when I was researching for this particular story, it was just, oh, she's the best, and it's amazing.
Yeah, and also it's your response too. If you F up like that, you don't make excuses and shift the blame. You say, you know what, I don't know what I did. I just flat out said it wrong. You know, and just accept the responsibility.
Yeah, and like I said, at the same time, the colleagues shouldn't go. I mean, they know that she made a mistake, right?
Oh yeah, this one's plain as day. I mean,
yeah,
it's not a wobbler.
It's scary stuff. I mean, it's really scary stuff.
It is. So I know we kind of gave our feedback as we went, but do you have any sort of closing thoughts on this?
No, I mean, yes, we did cover everything, but I think what's really important is obviously get a good defense attorney. And ask questions of everything. It's just nothing is black and white. I mean, you can see where mistakes can be made, and just don't give up the fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And on top of the defense attorney, you've got to get experts in there, because even if they turn over a bunch of documents to an attorney, they don't know what they're looking at. And as we found, I think in a lot of these cases, the devil is really in the details. You know. Hey, wait a minute. Who actually checked out that evidence? What actually was? What is the data to support that conclusion? You know, it is. Admittedly, this is very complicated and precise work, so it has to be vetted like crazy because people's lives are at stake. And I just got to give hats off to groups like the Innocence Project, because they have the resources. They have a bunch of students who can look this over and pore over it. And, that's how they exposed the Henry Lee stuff that probably would have never come up.
Yep. I mean, it is really good that there's organizations out there, because not everybody's got $1 million in their back pocket for their defense fund. Yeah.
So how can we prevent this from happening? Standards, all this and that, training, ethics. But I think bringing these things to light and studying what went wrong, because it's usually not just what went wrong with the analyst. It's like, what's wrong with the lab? What's wrong with the supervision? What's wrong with the attorneys who handle this? Like, what's wrong with the response to this crisis as well? Because let's face it, this is a human endeavor. There will be mistakes in forensic science. And
absolutely.
And there will be fraud as well, so there has to be ways to detect it. And just going off on a little bit of a tangent here, how do you define fraud? Obviously, if you're not even analyzing the drugs and just writing a report, that's clear fraud. But we also have these old techniques like microscopic examination of hair, like bite marks, that we now know aren't that reliable. How do we know that? Well, we've done DNA testing in a lot of cases to find out that whatever conclusion they reached with those old techniques is wrong. And so Another issue we have is people not, they've done the work, they've got a report, they've got notes, but they overstate the significance of that evidence. They say, well, in my opinion, that's a match. Well, your opinion is not what we're asking for. We want to know what the science is behind it. So if I'm testifying as a DNA analyst and I say, you know what, crime scene blood match a defendant, I expect 1 in 37 octillion people would have that type. Okay, I've got there's some weight behind my conclusion that there's a match and that it's that person's DNA. It's not just, hey, I'm a scientist, believe me.
Yeah, and that's what you're looking for, and really in all these cases, just straightforward, just give me the facts, look at the science, boom, there's your conclusion.
That's it. And, the chips fall where they may.
Well, that was great stuff and a great education. Thanks, Mehul, for that. And hopefully we didn't scare our listeners too much. And, question, get yourself, if you get into a situation, but try to learn from it and, hit us on social media or if you have any questions or any follow-up. As always, a big thanks to all of our listeners and followers on social media. We hope you enjoyed this episode on forensic fraud. Please be sure to subscribe to Crime Redefined to make sure you never miss an episode. And another big thanks to our sponsor. This episode of Crime Redefined was sponsored by MBA DNA Consulting, LLC in Los Angeles, California. Founder Mehul B. Anjaria strives to bridge science and law by providing forensic DNA consultation to attorneys and inmates. Check out mbadnaconsulting.com for more information and follow on Twitter at MBA DNA Consult.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.